Let's look at the LGBTQ rights movement. Backing up for 1 second, starting in the 1950s, we had the Lavender Scare. Many government officials were fired or pressured to quit because of their actual or rumored homosexuality. In 1951, the Mattachine Society started in Los Angeles. Its goal was to eliminate discrimination, prejudice, and bigotry against gay people. To give you a sign of the times, a feel for the times, in 1952, the psychiatrists labeled homosexuality as sexual deviation and a sociopathic personality disturbance. Okay, that was, psychiatrists then believed, a personality disorder. So they basically said it was wrong, it was bad. Uh, 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 in 1953, President Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450, which banned homosexuals from working for the federal government or any of its private contractors. Those are companies that work for the government. The order listed homosexuals as security risks, along with alcoholics and neurotics. There was a fear, basically, that some gays were communists or they'd be blackmailed by communist spies. Some communist spy would come along and say, hey, we're going to tell your wife, we're going to tell everyone, we're going to tell your spouse that you're really gay if you don't give us, secrets about the United States. So there was homosexuals were unfortunately seen as security risks. In 1969, the Stonewall riot happened. We'll talk about that in the next slide. 1973, there's progress. The American Psychiatric Association voted to remove homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. So you see there's already some success there. 1977, Harvey Milk was elected to here's Milk on the right. He was elected to the San Francisco city government. He was the first openly gay man elected in California. He introduced local gay rights law protecting gays and lesbians from being fired from their jobs. Milk also led a successful campaign against efforts to forbid homosexual teachers. In 1978, unfortunately, Milk was shot and killed by an unhappy city government worker who had mental health problems. So these are important moments in the LGBTQ rights movement. The most famous one was this 1969 Stonewall riot. Okay, the Stonewall Inn was a popular gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York City, and it's still around today. You can see this is what it looks like today. In June, it was a June summer night, around 1 a.m., police raided the bar to clean up the neighborhood of what the police called sexual deviants. Angry gay youth clashed with aggressive police officers in the streets, and it led to a 3-day riot. All right, you can see sort of pictures here. The police are carrying this person away, and there were riots for 3 nights. All right, here's an eyewitness saying, the police, came in the bar. They slammed people against the wall. They shoved people. They hurled insults that you can hard to imagine, said Mark Siegel, who was there that night. As officers conducted the raid, a crowd gathered outside shouting gay power. So there again, you see these people fighting for their rights. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people who were forced out of the bar that night taunted, that is, they teased the police. Some threw bottles and stones. And there was a riot for several days. In 2019, the head of the New York City Police apologized for the raid and said it was not the right thing to do. Moving on now to the Native American civil rights movement. Let's back up for a second. Really, the last time we talked about Native Americans was in 1934 in the New Deal. We had the Indian Reorganization Act, and FDR's head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, John Collier, was a good guy. They said that tribes can own land. That's undoing the Dawes Severalty Act of the 1880s. We're going to promote tribal land ownership, and the federal government will give tribes more land. The government will also hire Native Americans and help them with scholarships and loans. In World War II, the Navajo Code Talkers and the Bushmaster units both fought very well. In the 1940s and 50s, the U.S. federal government returned to its policy of trying to break up tribes, and Native Americans were encouraged to leave the reservations in a policy known as termination. So the idea of the government was, let's terminate, let's end the reservations. By 1960, more than half of Native Americans lived off reservations. A lot had moved into cities and they'd assimilated, they'd blended in with the mainstream white culture, and they'd lost much of their traditional Native American culture. In 1968, some Native Americans started the American Indian Movement, AIM, and their original goals were to help Native Americans in the cities. And later on, they wanted things like a revitalization of traditional Native American culture. If you remember, this is the same thing Pope had called for in 1680 in the Southwest, and Neolin, who worked with Pontiac in the 1760s, and the Prophet, who worked with Tecumseh in the War of 1812. These are, again, Native Americans saying, let's reject the white European ways. Let's go back to our traditional culture. They also wanted self rule over tribal areas, and AIM wanted the return of lands that they believe had been illegally taken. Okay. AIM was pretty aggressive, pretty militant, and pretty radical. Here's an example of another group. In 1969, this is really interesting. In 1969, a group of Native Americans called the Indians of All Tribes, which had some AIM members in it, took over the federal prison of Alcatraz in San Francisco Harbor. So here you can see Alcatraz. It was a federal prison. It's in the middle of San Francisco Harbor. Why did the Native Americans take it over? The initial group demanded control of Alcatraz so it could develop a center of Native American studies and a museum. Again, they're trying to remember and continue their traditional culture. And this group, the Indian of All Tribes, won over San Francisco's mostly liberal population with clever arguments. For example, they offered to buy Alcatraz from the federal government for $24 worth of glass beads and red cloth. That's the same price that the Dutch had supposedly paid the Native Americans for the island of Manhattan back in 1626. And the Indians of All Tribes also argued there was this 1868 treaty with the Dakota Sioux, where the U.S. government let them take possession of any unused or abandoned federal land. Well, this prison had been closed since 1963. So this group argued the prison should belong to the Native Americans in South Dakota. And the Indians of All Tribes actually occupied and took over Alcatraz for 18 months. So you can see them here. They're calling this federal prison, they're calling it Indian land, and they spray painted some graffiti that shows you, they're saying, hey, you whites are on our land. All right. Liberal San Francisco city residents would bring them supplies and food by boat. And the Indians of All Tribes also used the law of discovery argument. When a white government lawyer asked, what's that? What's the law of discovery? The Native American lawyer said that was basically used by Columbus. It's finders, keepers, losers, weepers. That's what you white Europeans said when you came here in 1492. And that's what we're saying. We kind of found this land, Alcatraz. We're taking it. It's ours. In 1971, the authorities decided to end the occupation by going in and taking it over when the group was at its smallest, and the police and the federal agents removed just about 15 people. So the occupiers did not achieve their goals, but President Nixon did agree to end the termination policy. 1973, AIM, again, that is the American Indian Movement. AIM occupied Wounded Knee in South Dakota for 70 days. It's about 2.5 months. Why Wounded Knee? What happened there in 1890? Well, if you remember, and you can look at this picture up here, in 1890, the Native Americans were having a ghost dance. One of their tribal dances is basically sun worship, and the U.S. soldiers thought it was a war dance, and they were preparing to attack. So the U.S. soldiers attacked them first and massacred about 300 men, women, and children. It was horrible. So here in the 1973, you see this group is taking it back. Okay, and they're trying to show that the U.S. government failed to honor Native American treaties. The federal government did move in at one point, and they killed 2 Native men, and the activists ultimately surrendered, and the federal government agreed to examine its treaty rights. But again, lots of protest on the part of these people of color. Just a more recent example, there was Standing Rock in North Dakota, 2016, 2017. To make a long story short, Some oil companies wanted to put in a pipeline, and here these Native Americans said, no, this is our land, this is sacred land, and this Native American has chained himself to the construction equipment, so they can't put in the pipeline. So just trying to show you this pattern of protest continues. Latino civil rights movements. So, back during World War II, remember, there was a labor shortage in America with a lot of white soldiers off fighting in the war. So, Mexican American workers were allowed to work on farms in the Southwest. We call this the Bracero program. You also remember in Southern California, there were the Zoot Suit riots, and the Latinos in the Bushmasters unit fought very well. After World War II, Congress renewed the Bracero program and let a lot of Mexican Americans work in the Southwest. In 1954, however, the US government changed its policy, and the US government did Operation Wetback. Wetback is basically a slur, it's an insult referring to how some illegal immigrants, cross the river Rio Grande between Mexico and America and get into the US. In Operation Wetback, the US government deported over 1 million people. Basically, the Korean War veterans had come home, and so there was lots of job competition. So the US federal government said these Latino farm workers basically had to leave. Some deportees were illegal Mexican immigrants, but some of them were US citizens of Mexican American heritage. And so a whole bunch of civil rights were violated as basically 1 million people were expelled. Many of these people died. I don't know about exact numbers. Maybe several dozen people died because they had to move and go to Mexico without food and water, and the sun was very hot. The Latino farm workers who stayed working on the farms, picking fruits, picking vegetables, faced long hours, very low pay. There was no bathrooms in the fields, and dangerous fertilizers and chemicals that made you sick and gave you cancer. Really bad working conditions. So in 1962, Cesar Chavez unionized the California grape pickers through nonviolence. And he and they called for a national boycott of grapes and lettuce. So here you can see Cesar Chavez and the workers, and here you can see these boycotts saying that don't eat grapes and lettuce, don't give money to those companies because they're really not treating the workers well. Cesar Chavez drove all over the place. He traveled about 300,000 miles in 6 months, driving from farm to farm, getting these workers to register in the union. And he created the United Farm Workers so that these workers could come together, they'd be stronger in a group, and they'd fight for their rights. Also, there were sit-ins and protests, and that led to the Bilingual Education Acts of 1968 and 73. So basically, now it's law that you have to provide some bilingual education for people who maybe don't speak English as their primary language or native language. So again, lots of civil rights movements, and I'm just trying to show you that there's still protests going on today. For example, this is 1954, Birmingham, Alabama. The racist white police chief Bull Connor used fire hoses against these African American protesters. And here in 2016, police used fire hoses against Native Americans. So I'm just trying to show you there's still people fighting for what they believe is right. Moving on to criminal rights, a few famous court cases you should know about. Gideon versus Wainwright. Gideon basically, I believe he'd been playing pool in a pool hall down in Florida. And I don't remember the details, but basically he was found guilty. He was put in jail, and he said, this is not fair. I was too poor to hire a lawyer, and the government should provide a lawyer for everybody, or for poor people. And so he sued, saying he didn't get a fair trial, and the Supreme Court agreed. So in 1963, the Supreme Court unanimously, that is 9-0, decided that people have a right to legal counsel if they can't afford one. Other court case, Miranda versus Arizona. So this happened in Phoenix, Arizona. Miranda was arrested. I don't remember why. And the result of this court case is that now you get read if you're arrested, you get read what are called your Miranda rights, or Miranda warrant. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You might have seen this in the TV show or the movies. And it says somewhere else, you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, the court will provide one for you. And that comes from this Gideon court ruling. So here you see criminal rights making progress. In 1978, there's a famous court case involving affirmative action. So basically, this is called the University of California versus Bakke. The University of California Med School rejected Bakke, who was a white man, even though his GPA, his grades, were higher than some minority applicants. Bakke sued under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and he claimed reverse discrimination. He said, I was not treated equally just because I was white. This is unfair. And the Supreme Court ruled that Bakke should be admitted to the med school, but we should try to have diversity. It's good for education. It's good for students if they're learning in a diverse classroom. So basically, it says affirmative action is legal. It's okay. The court also said that race can be one of many factors in admissions, but the court said racial quotas are illegal. You cannot set number limits. That's going too far to say in this classroom we need to have 5 whites and 5 Latinos and 5 African Americans and 5 Asian. Those sorts of number limits, they said that's not right. And the court also said efforts to achieve diversity will be judged by strict scrutiny. So basically, the court said to these universities and these colleges and these med schools, you can aim for diversity and bring in different people. Race can be one of many factors, can't be the only factor, and you can't have quotas. Okay. So the court here basically said diversity, yes, but no quotas, no percentages, no points, no graphs. Okay. And so, here you see the scales of justice here, right? And this says affirmative. It's just hard to do. And you see the schools today, colleges today are still struggling with this, how to be fair to everyone. Okay. Okay, environmental movement. People were caring more about the environment and pollution. One of the reasons why was because in 1962, Rachel Carson published her famous book, Silent Spring. Basically, it said that companies, farmers were using DDT, that was a chemical spray that killed mosquitoes. And she found out that the birds were eating the mosquitoes, so the chemical spray was getting into the birds and it was weakening the birds' shells. So when the mama birds sat on their shells, the shells cracked, and basically mama bird ended up killing her kids by accident. And so there were no baby birds and they were not chirping, and it was a silent spring. So here you can see the chart, okay? So basically the government got rid of DDT, basically. We get the Clean Air Act in 1970 that put laws on companies and laws on factories about what pollution is okay and how much is okay. You got to basically run a clean factory. Again, here you see people protesting, okay? People writing books and protesting and marching and voting. And so the federal government changed. Also, the Environmental Protection Agency was founded, and they make sure that companies don't pollute too much and ruin the air and the forests and the water. 1972 to 1974 is the Watergate scandal. So basically, Nixon was worried about his secret bombing of Cambodia in the Vietnam War. He was worried that was going to get out and word of it was going to leak. And he hired some thugs, some of his boys, to break into the Democratic Party offices, which were in the Watergate buildings in downtown DC. Okay. And a security guard saw the door had been broken into, and there's an investigation, and it basically leads back to Nixon. Nixon had been taping conversations in his office in the White House, but there was an 18.5-minute gap. And here you see Nixon here. And before he could be impeached and convicted and kicked out of office, Nixon resigned. And here you see the famous photo of him leaving the White House because it was clear that he was going to get kicked out of office, that he was behind this break-in. So the next president was Gerald Ford, athletic guy. He played college football, and he pardoned Nixon. And the big problem in the U.S. in the mid to late 1970s was inflation. And Ford's approach to beat inflation, that is rising prices, was not effective. He basically came up with these buttons, says whip inflation now, but that doesn't really help. So why was there inflation? So first of all, remember there was the 1973 Yom Kippur War in the Middle East between the Arab Muslims and Israel, and the Arab Muslims were mad at the U.S. for supporting Israel, so they do an oil embargo. Supply of oil goes down, as you can see in these pictures, and so the price of oil goes way up. And so the price of heating your home and driving and getting t-shirts from the factory to the store, prices went up, and we call that inflation. All right. It also happened again in 1979 because of the Iranian Revolution. The supply of oil went down. So inflation was a big problem. Prices are going through the roof. And so people's paychecks didn't buy as much stuff. People were not happy. The next president was Jimmy Carter. He was a Democrat from Georgia. He went to the U.S. Naval Academy and then worked in nuclear subs. And then he left the Navy and was a peanut farmer on his farm in Georgia. That was the family business. He then went into politics. He was in the Georgia Senate, became the governor of Georgia, and he was the president from 1977 to 81. A very religious, devout Christian, seen as a clean guy after Nixon, who was seen as sort of ruthless. Carter was a very clean guy, but he really struggled with inflation and with the Iranian hostage crisis, which we'll get to in a second. Carter's big triumph is the 1979 Camp David Accords. Remember that Israel had seized the Sinai Peninsula, and as part of this deal, Israel gives it back to Egypt. And here you see the Egyptian head over here and the Israeli head over here, and they signed this deal. And there was some peace between Israel on the right and Egypt on the left. In 1979, there's the Iranian Revolution. The Iranians toss out the Shah, who was the dictator we put in power to stop communism, and the Ayatollah Khomeini took over, and Iran basically became a theocracy run by some very conservative Muslims, and they took over the American embassy and took Americans hostage. Okay, so I will show you a picture of that here. Carter tried to rescue the hostages with helicopters, and it didn't work. Sand got in the helicopter engines, and they crashed. You can see it was front page news. So that was a big setback for Carter. Also, because of the Iranian Revolution, supply of oil went down. Here you see these cars waiting in line. Price of oil went up. We call that inflation. And again, it was eating into people's paychecks. So basically, if you see here in the 1970s, inflation in blue spikes. Okay, inflation in blue spikes. Here it is again. If you look at Carter on the bottom right, inflation went up, unemployment went up. And basically what happened is what we call stagflation. Stag is for stagnant or flat or not moving. The economy was not growing, it was not moving, and there was inflation. So that was a bad combo. All right, stagnant economy, not growing, high unemployment, and inflation because of the oil shocks. It was not good. So what were the political consequences of that for Carter? And here you can see again the pendulum of history. History is nothing but action and reaction, cause and effect. This stagflation plus the failed rescue mission of the hostages in Iran meant Carter blanked the 1980 election. And I'll give you a hint. You can look at this map, and the conservative Republican, Ronald Reagan, was elected president. Just to give you a little bit of pop culture, in the 1970s, muscle cars were really popular and cool, okay? And here's some 1970s fashion, some bell bottoms, some wide colors. Brown was very in. Some hit TV shows. I remember these were on TV when I was growing up as a kid, okay? Disco was very popular, all right? And soul music, for example, James Brown, the godfather of soul, and Hank Aaron playing for the Atlanta Braves broke Babe Ruth's all-time home run record. I hope this was clear. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.